Hello, welcome to Letchworth Cable Access. I'm Saul Hauser, and this is Senator Rob Ortt.
Good to be here, Saul. Thank you for having me.
Now, you're running for Congress for the 27th District.
Yes, I am.
And can you tell me a little bit about what brought you to decide to run for Congress?
Sure. Well, it's not something that you come to lightly, and so I think a lot of my past experience is kind of what brought me to be here today. So I grew up in Niagara County. I grew up in North Tonawanda. So I'm kind of a Western New Yorker, born and bred. Um, Graduated from Canisius College in 2001, and then, like a lot of folks, I watched the September 11th attacks on television, and I was 22 years old, and I knew that the rest of my life, no matter what happened, would be different after that day. It was one of those days that, for a lot of young adults or adults, you just knew that you were crossing a line. That we would always look back on the world before September 11th and the world after it. So for a lot of young folks, they don't know what it was like to go to the airport 10 minutes before your flight and still get on the plane, right? I mean, and I say that somewhat in jest, but it's true. You could get to the airport 20 minutes before your flight was leaving, race through and get to the gate. Your family was allowed to go to the gate with you. Obviously, that's a very different world. Most young people don't know a world where we don't have American troops somewhere in Iraq, Afghanistan, fighting against these insurgent networks. And so we live in a very different world today, and for me, that was a motivator. I joined the Army National Guard, ultimately deployed to Afghanistan in 2008, returned, was asked to run for mayor of my hometown, North Tonawanda, ran for mayor, won, and served as mayor for 5 years. And North Tonawanda, for those that don't know, it's a community not unlike a lot of communities here in Wyoming County. It's a city of about 32,000, kind of a bedroom community, and with a small downtown. And when I was mayor, we saw a lot of positive development and growth, sort of a rebirth, kind of like you're seeing here in Perry. And so after that, I was elected to the Senate in 2014, took office in 15, and I've been a New York State Senator for the past 5 years.
Well, can you tell me something about something you've done in the Senate that you've really seen the impact of on somebody, that you've really seen how that benefits people?
Sure. I think two areas. One, I was chair of the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities Committee in the Senate for my first 4 years, and that was a committee that has an unbelievable impact on people who are very vulnerable here in New York. Whether it was folks or families with a loved one that has a developmental or intellectual disability, autism, Asperger's, some other form of ID or DD. And then on the same token, when you talk about the mental health aspect, for me as a veteran, veterans' mental health is a big issue for me. I think it should be a big issue for every American when you consider that the suicide rate for veterans somewhere is between 20 and 22 a day, which is higher than the civilian population. And that should alarm every American, that here are people who went to combat, served the country, in some cases survived, the horrors of war, come back, and they're not able to survive civilian life here in the United States, and so we have to do a better job when it comes to mental health across the board, obviously for veterans in this case specifically. So we brought funding, Joseph P. Dwyer program, to Niagara County and to Orleans County. So rural counties that don't always have robust mental health services, probably not unlike Wyoming County, we were able to bring funding, Joseph P. Dwyer funding, to those counties, and it's a peer-to-peer program. And so, no question, that program saves lives, helps veterans cope, and maybe get them clinical services that they ultimately need. So I think that is certainly an area where I know I'm very proud of. And then also some of the work we did to provide more funding for better wages for direct support professionals who work with people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. Huge victory that we had a couple years ago. So those are just two areas that I was very proud of.
That's pretty great, yeah. And continuing on healthcare, if we're
Mhm.
okay talking about kind of what you're planning now, um, healthcare debt is a major issue. Many Americans face healthcare costs they can't afford, and they have to ration their medication or put off surgeries. How do you plan to help people afford necessary medical care?
Sure. Um, so I first want to start with I think we've gotten to this point where, healthcare is a dominating issue in every election, in every facet of life, right? Whether you're talking to an employer or just somebody that needs access to healthcare. Because the cost, that's really what drives a lot of this is the cost of healthcare. It's tough on our employers. It's very expensive if they have to provide it, which means if they have to provide healthcare, somewhere it ultimately results in they hire less people because every employee there's that additional cost of providing healthcare, which they do, but there's a cost to that. If you're not on an employer plan, or if you, depending on what your situation may be, that cost is also could be an impediment to what you're talking about, seeking medical care because you go, well, I can't afford it right now, or I'm worried that I can't afford it. But I do think we need to start with most people. I think would argue that the United States healthcare system is the best from a quality perspective in the world. We know that there's people who come here, even from other modern countries, whether it's Canada, whether it's Europe, they come here to get special service, whether it's surgery or some type of specialty care, because we have the best doctors and some of the best services in the world. The issue is the cost. That's what I think is the impediment to the access. So we definitely have to do a better job, I think, at wherever we can reduce that red tape and that middleman. Healthcare is one of the only areas that I can think of where you are buying something. You're buying a service, right? You're paying and you want. It's one of the only areas that I can think of where you don't buy that service directly from the people that provide the service. You buy it from third parties who then negotiate the services for you. And every time there's someone else involved, they need to get paid, right? And so those are some of the things that increase healthcare costs. I think where we can increase competition and break up some of these giant insurance monopolies that control prices then, I think that's a way to drive costs down. That has to be the sole goal. You can drive healthcare costs down, make it more affordable, and allow people to get the services they need. There's a lot of people out there that I know pay for a lot of things in their health plan that they may never use, or they may not use at least in the short term. And if you could maybe change that a little bit, I think you could also drive down costs and allow people to pay for, even if it is a little more expensive, but they're paying for something they're going to use. But I do think the healthcare system in this country, from a quality perspective, is good. I think we need to reduce costs. Unfortunately, a lot of the discussion you hear about healthcare centers around the government taking over healthcare. And I would tell folks that support that I don't know that you're making it infinitely better. I think you're going to trade one set of pros and cons for potentially a different set of pros and cons, right? So you may address certain issues and address those issues, but you're also going to probably create an additional set of problems that I don't know is better or worse. It's just different, right? So you can talk to a lot of countries that have government provided health care, and they would probably tell you here today, well, these are things that are good, and these are things that are not so good. And so I don't know if that's the answer, especially when a lot of people enjoy their doctor, enjoy their health coverage, but we're trying to make it more affordable. So that needs to be, I think, the focus.
So one proposal that's been kind of going around that I wonder how you feel about a public option in addition to private care is something that certainly some of the presidential candidates have talked about.
Yeah, I think that when you talk about a public option or a Medicare option for those that want it, I mean, as a veteran, I know that a lot of veterans get that through the VA, right? They get their health coverage basically paid for by the government. Now they served, and so you could argue they've earned that benefit. But what I hear a lot is not just a public option, but basically we want that to be the only option. And I think that's where I get a little concerned is that I don't know. I would say that is not the way to go. from my perspective. And we see this even in New York State. They're talking about the state taking over, creating the only option. So I think, options are good. And as long as we can pay for them, that's good too. And if they drive down costs, that's really good. Because I think you'll see more people would have health coverage if it was affordable, right? That was always the thing with the Obamacare. They were trying to get people covered, but they didn't address the underlying issue, which was the cost. So I think we treated to use a healthcare pun, we treated the symptom, not the disease.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. So something I wanted to talk about, if we can get a little bit into a bill that you voted on this year in the state, was the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act,
Okay.
which it passed this year. It's been up for a vote for several years, I believe. And it prohibits discrimination based on gender identity or expression.
Sure.
And you voted against it. So what led to that decision?
Sure. So, like a lot of bills, so I want to start, a lot of bills, there's no bill that comes up in the Senate, whether it's a Republican bill or a Democratic bill, that doesn't, it always sounds like who could be against it, right? Because the titles are always, are would lead you to think, well, everyone's going to support this bill. So the first thing, there as you may know, or some of your viewers should know, there's a number of laws already that prevent discrimination based on gender, based on ethnicity, basically any kind of discrimination. There's several laws in New York, actually, probably more than a lot of other states, that prevent or make it, you can be fined or whatever, that try to prevent discrimination based on what have you, in this case, gender. So in some respects, I felt that the bill was duplicative. The one aspect that was, I think, the most controversial about the bill was regarding things like restrooms, right? And not only, to me, I think most folks, when you're going about your daily life, I think it's pretty. I don't think people are sitting there going, you know what, the biggest challenge facing our state, or facing our economy, or facing what have you, is people aren't sure what bathroom to use, right? I would argue that is not a major issue, if at all, for most Americans. I understand there could be an issue for some, but I think this causes a host of other concerns for people about who is in the bathroom with my child, or with, in a sporting event, or in a movie theater. Let's take it from a business standpoint. So in a movie theater, as you know, you're not talking about a single-use bathroom. You're talking about a bathroom that is designed to have 10, 15 folks in there. So they're going to have to completely reconfigure how that is done to avoid a potential lawsuit, depending on if somebody wanted to file suit. So there was a lot of issues that I felt that were surrounding this bill that, to me, had less to do with gender discrimination, and it had more to do with a narrative that we got this through. It's been there for a number of years. This has been, it's turned into kind of more of a national partisan divide issue. But the truth is, like I said, again, there are a number of laws. If it was just as simple as saying you can't discriminate against somebody, if you have a transgender person who wants to rent an apartment, you can't say, I'm not renting this apartment to you because you're transgender. Obviously, that's wrong under the law, I believe, even before this bill was passed. But when you under this bill, I think it creates almost an undefinable baseline for what would constitute discrimination. So in other words, if I run a restaurant and there's we don't have a gender non-conforming bathroom, you could file suit that I'm discriminating against you. I don't know if that's right, meaning I don't know if that's correct. I also don't know if that's helpful in New York's business climate. So those were some of my concerns of why I voted no on that bill, along with, I think, 18 or I don't know, it wasn't just myself, obviously. There were some other folks who shared those concerns.
Well, I believe that the enforcement, and I'm just saying this based on my impression of it, so I'm not 100% sure that this is correct either. I believe it would only be like if you told somebody you can't use this bathroom because you're transgender, for example. because of your gender identity expression, that would be when they would be able to file a suit or something. But
I actually, so that would be, in a perfect world, you'd be right. But I think actually the way the law was written, it would actually, and we've seen this in other parts of the state, in New York City and other parts of even the country where they have similar laws, is that it actually, because of New York State's, because of other laws that surround litigation, it actually forces businesses to sort of be preemptive, because again, it can be, I don't have to say you can't use this I mean, if somebody did that, I don't know what they'd be thinking. You can't use. But if you don't actually have to say that, if it's your impression that you felt that you were discriminated against because of something, because there wasn't a bathroom that you identified with or you felt uncomfortable, that would be reason enough to say you were discriminated against. And that's where I think it gets very tricky, when your perception, because how do I know what your perception is, right? I mean, I don't necessarily know that. And I think, not to say we're looking to, we want to live in a society where everybody feels comfortable. I think we all agree on that. But at the same time, I think you can move in the other direction where other people feel uncomfortable, because I don't know if you all of a sudden perceive that I did something that was discriminatory. Now I'm in court, or I have to get an attorney, or maybe my business is in jeopardy, maybe through no real direct intention. You know what I mean? And so there was, sometimes a lot of these laws, it just goes to the way these laws are drafted, that is a rationale for voting no, because I think these laws are far more expansive than somebody would gather just by reading, let's say, the bill memo or the sponsor's memo. So that was again the reason I voted no. There's a ton of laws in New York, and I would support any law that prevented discrimination and somebody being able to live their life and get a job and get a place to live and go about their daily life for any reason, quite frankly.
so if in Congress, like, a bill came up that was similar in the intention, but that was written in a way that you felt was more
Yes, yeah,
preventative.
my vote would be the same, and that just doesn't go for this bill. There's a host of bills that we passed in Albany in my 5 years, certainly this past 6 months, that I felt were there. The folks who support the bill focus on maybe one narrow point, but the bill is very expansive, and lawyers have a way of interpreting bills sometimes in ways that are not always, and I've seen it in my short time in Albany. We'll vote on a bill, or we'll pass a bill, and we're told this. Then you find out from somebody on the ground, a business owner, an advocate, somebody they'll tell you, that's not how it's actually working. It's working this way. And so that's very important sometimes when you're, and I'll be honest, we get these bills. Now, this bill was around for a long time, so we had the ability certainly to go through it. But there's a number of bills that are constructed, at 11:58. It's on your desk at 12 o'clock, and there's no way, I'm not going to even pretend to viewers that you're able to read, the nitty gritty, and I'm not a lawyer. So even if I was to read it, I don't always know what that really means. So we rely on our counsel and our staff, and I listen to constituents of mine as well, and try to make the best decision on any bill, whether it's this legislation or others.
So in terms of other bills that kind of haven't had quite the intended effect, I actually have a question on here about, in terms of dairy farming. Dairy farming is the largest industry in our county for certain. We have more cows than people.
No doubt.
And if I can find the question that I've written down. Here it is. So, with low milk prices for years and years, and then with the tariffs lately and trade wars, that's put a lot of pressure on farmers and caused some to even go out of business. So how would you be a voice for farmers in our area?
Well, first off, I would try. I guess I would say I would try to continue to be a voice. Much of my current Senate district has a number of farms. Now, I don't have nearly as many dairy farms in my Senate district as are in Wyoming County or Genesee County. But there are dairy farms, and there's a number of other, crop farms. But dairy farms, you raise a good point, because they're under a lot of additional sort of pressures, because they're year round, right? I mean, that's the first thing. They're not seasonal, and so whether it's labor, whether it's the price of milk, whether it's the tariffs or some of the global trade discussions or conflicts that are happening, all of that impacts them. But even before that, they were under a lot of pressure because of the milk supply. There was more milk, which was driving prices down. But they're also you sort of have to continue to produce it, otherwise you will cease to exist as a farm, as a dairy farm. So it's almost like you're sort of getting pinched on both ends, and you got to sell your milk for whatever you can get, even if it's less than what it cost you to produce it, right? And so who does that favor? That certainly favors the larger dairy farms, although they are still under pressure. But if you're a small dairy farm, you're really, your viability is really in question. And that's true for a lot of farms. And I'm the ranker currently on the Senate Agriculture Committee. I've toured a number of farms, including here in Wyoming County. And I don't pretend to be an expert on farming. I'm not going to tell you that I didn't grow up on a farm. But I have met a number of farmers and have become, I hope, a strong voice for agriculture. The challenge is it's not always, I can talk to 3 farmers and they might be over here, and you talk to 2 other farmers and they may have a different take. So it's not a homogenous group in that they're all saying the same thing. Different farms need different things. I would say that this past session in Albany, we passed a bill that I think is going to be very problematic for a number of farms, particularly dairy farms, when you talk about wages. Since 2012, between 2012 and 2017, we lost, and I can't remember the percentage, but we lost about a third of New York farms. They ceased to exist. Either they were merged with larger farms or they went out of business. That was far more than the national average. Right? There's a contraction across the country, but there was a acute contraction here in New York State. And that worries me as we go forward, because many of the laws that are affecting agriculture right now are being written by people who have no farms in their district. They represent places like Queens or the Bronx. And that's fine. Those people need representation too. But in a lot of cases, they don't have an understanding of the challenges facing our farms. On the national level, I have supported some of the tariffs and some of the trade negotiations going on as a means to an end. Meaning if it helps us get to a better trade deal, that's a positive. I've negotiated contracts before when I was mayor. Sometimes you have to play a little hardball to get to where you want to be. But I don't support the tariffs as an end in and of themselves, if that makes sense. It's a nuanced issue, but I think that's an important nuance. So I believe the president and this administration have tried to recalibrate some of our trade relationships with our partners like China and some other countries who are taking advantage, I think a lot of people feel, of the United States. But if it's a means to an end, good. But if it's an end in and of itself, that's a long-term problem, not only for farmers, but for a number of folks. So I think you need somebody in there in Congress who understands this issue, who are listening, working with our dairy farms, and trying to get to whether it's on labor, that's a huge issue for dairy farms, as you well know, and as many of your farmers who are watching this program will attest. So that's a big issue in and of itself. I think coming up with a long-term solution for dairy farms, there are programs in place that work really well for your seasonal farms when it comes to labor. Those programs don't work for dairy farmers because they can't send their labor home in October because they still have to produce milk right now. And so coming up with long-term programs that work for them, I think might be a way to ease some of the pain, right? You may not be able to solve every issue, but if I can't fix this one, maybe we can do something over here and that kind of a thing. And I just think having someone in Congress that understands the importance, this whole district, not only Wyoming County, but this district, I would have to imagine one of the largest, if not the largest, economic driver in NY27 is agriculture.
And certainly with the tariffs, as you were saying, as a means to an end there, they could be beneficial. But at the same time, during the time, if they remain in place too long, and they've been in place for, I believe, over a year now.
Yeah, probably a little over a year.
Definitely squeezed dairy farmers.
Yes, you're right. You're going to feel that pain, and so I think that's while that's going on. That's where we have to maybe there's things we can do. There's other things we can do to try to relieve some of that pressure on our farmers. Right? Maybe there's some other aspect of federal agriculture policy that we can address. That maybe so you're getting a lot of pressure here, but I'm going to relieve some pressure somewhere else in your operation that allows you to be more competitive, because that's the one thing I think people have to remember is our farmers are not competing. The guy in Wyoming County is not competing against the farmer in Cattaraugus County. He's competing against the farmer in other parts of the country and even in other parts of the world. And we have to remember that some of those all of our farmers are price takers. Unlike the burger, right? So if I raise the minimum wage on McDonald's, I'm not going to drive to Ohio to get my hamburger. I'm just going to go to the McDonald's here and pay the higher cost of that hamburger, right? But because they can pass that cost on. Farmers can't. So every time there's an additional cost on them, they can't pass that through to the consumer because these are commodities. The price is set. If the price of apples or milk is this, then whatever that cost is, the farmer essentially has to eat that cost because they can only get what they can get. Wegmans isn't going to pay more for the New York apples or milk because that's just not how it goes. And so I think we as elected officials have to remember that unlike other industries where they can maybe just pass on additional cost to the consumer, farmers can't do that. They're price takers, not price makers. And that's a real cause of concern because if you're producing something and you're losing money every time you're selling it through no fault of your own, how long are you going to be able to survive?
And that's a good point also about the price taking part of it. It's
No
really,
question.
When you're a farmer, you can't set what people pay. You can't.
Right. You're told, and especially dairy farmers, it's the co-op that tells you this is what we can sell your milk for. And so, however expensive it was for you to produce it, this is the most you're going to get if we sell it. And so I think we as elected officials have to be cognizant of that when we're setting agriculture policy.
So I want to kind of switch topics now to climate change because it's a pretty important, probably one of the most important things long term that we can talk about. And it's a pretty imminent climate emergency the world's facing. And the United Nations has said that by next year, the world has to cut carbon emissions by 7.6% and achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which is really only 30 years from now. And that's just in order to keep the rise in temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So how do you think we can take responsibility for our effect on the planet and be responsible stewards of the world for future generations?
So this is another issue that I think has become polarized. I think most people would agree that the climate changes, right? I think the difference between Democrats, Republicans, people on the right and the left centers on what part of that change or how much of that are humans responsible for, and then the other thing is what can we do to stop that, right? Because I think more often than not, folks on the left want to use government, whether it's increased taxation, to drive different behaviors, right? Whether it's taxing cars more, whether it's trying to do things like that. My concern is there's no question when you do stuff like that, you're going to have a negative impact on the economy, certainly in the short term, because sometimes the economy is not in a spot where it can transition, right? So I think what me as a conservative, as a Republican would say is we need to drive dollars to R&D to use our economy, use people who make things to come up with products that are more sustainable and more environmentally efficient. I would argue today, we are more environmentally conscious than we've been maybe in the history of our country. I don't think there could be any debate about that. Now, for some people, you know, we cite statistics, and it's this existential crisis. And I don't know, you know, we didn't have data 200 years ago, but maybe if we had it then, like we do now, they would have thought we were in an existential crisis too. But like I said, as long as you have actors too, like China and India, so we often talk about what the United States can do, and that's fine. We're the United States, and we should talk about things that our country can do, whether it's climate change or other topics. But I think it's hard to talk about this in a vacuum, meaning if China's not, you have 1 billion people, if they're not getting their emissions under control, if they're not doing things that are going to impact their economy, first of all, I don't know how much the U.S. alone can drive that, right, to get to these numbers you're talking about. But also, my concern is we're putting our economy at a disadvantage versus China, India, other countries. Because what very often seems to happen, and this happened in my district, we have a coal plant that is shutting down in a couple of months. Now, not all of that is due to climate policy. Some of it's due to natural gas prices and other things. But when you have people who are unemployed, a 50-year-old person who works at that plant, that facility, to put food on his table or her table, and when they're unemployed, it's little consolation to them to say, well, 100 years from now, the planet's going to be a better place. I know this stinks now, but don't worry. You know, especially when that person telling them that lives in Manhattan or is a young college kid, right? You know what I mean? Nothing against young college kids, but it's just we can't be myopic to the fact that when we do these things, there's real economic impacts to real Americans who are working and trying to. So I think we have to take into account the economy. You know, I know Greta Thunberg. You know, she's a super. You know, she's all over the place right now, right? But she's 16. You know, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when I was 16, no one listened to me, and rightfully so, because I was 16. I didn't know how the world worked. And it's not just as simple. Where we have to be cognizant of what we're doing and how that's impacting American workers. And I think if we try to use our economy, our capitalist economy, no one is better at innovation than the United States. And history would bear that out. Tons of innovations that have occurred that have helped the world have started here in the United States. And it's because we invest in R&D, we put R&D dollars in so that companies can create a better light bulb that lasts for 1,000 years and somehow costs less, right? And that's why people buy it too, because I'll pay for this now and I won't have to buy another light bulb for the next 30 years or whatever it is, right? So those are all things that I think we need to be doing more of, and that's okay as the market drives that. But I think when people hear about things like we did in Albany, where we empowered a 21-member climate council, unelected, that's going to make policy. Now that's our job as a legislator. That's why I'm elected, is to make policy. When I punt, now I voted against this, when I punt that responsibility to a scientist, no doubt a smart person, but they are not elected to make policy. They're elected to advise. And those people are going to make policy. Who knows what it's going to be? And again, I would argue that the biggest emissions coming out of New York State is probably coming out of New York City. I would have to believe that to be true. And yet, very often, we have academics, scientists, folks from these places telling people in Wyoming County how to be better stewards of the environment. I don't know the people of Wyoming County, when I drive around here, need to be lectured by somebody from Fordham about how best to secure the environment, because we've been great stewards of the environment because this is our livelihood, right? Farmers, right? You don't have agriculture if you don't have a healthy environment, and so I would argue that we need a balanced approach. Very often, just more taxation and more government and more red tape, and stopping companies from innovating and creating jobs and putting more people unemployed. I don't know that that's the only answer when it comes to the environment. I know it's important. It's important to me. I'm 40 years old. I want it to be here when I'm 30 years from now. So I think that is important. But I do think there's a difference on, again, we can agree on the problem, or at least aspects of the problem, but that doesn't mean we agree on the solution. I think that's where the divide is.
So what would you say if a bill came up? And I know that we're a little bit close on time right
Sure.
now, but
Because I talk too much.
well, that's what you're
Yeah,
elected to do.
that's the whole thing, right?
Yep. But what would you say if a bill came up in Congress, something like a cap and trade system like what Canada's instituted?
So again, I've had concerns with cap and trade, at least personally, in the past. I guess I would have to look at the specifics. You know, it's hard to talk hypothetically about a bill. I have to look at it. But previous iterations of cap and trade, I would have voted no on. And certainly things like the Green New Deal, which I don't know if there's a high chance that comes up for a vote, but I would be voting no on that for all the reasons I just talked about, because I don't think that takes into account any of the things that I just talked about as it relates to my constituents or people, working people here in Western New York. Do I think we can get to if we're serious about it, can we get to a bill that I think works? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. But what I've seen coming from a lot of folks on the left side of the political spectrum, those would be very difficult for me to support at this point. But again, I always say, I know we can talk about hypotheticals. I look at any bill, even if I think in my head, there's no way I can support this bill, I still will break that down and go over with my staff and also hear from my constituents. Because if my constituents say this bill's good for us, then maybe that changes my mind.
All right. Well, thank you. We're getting a little bit. I think we're beyond our normal time.
Beyond our normal time. Holy cow! What happens now?
Well, I guess we just finished. So thank you
Sure.
so much for coming in and talking. And it was great talking to you and hearing your perspective on
Sure.
things.
Well, I appreciate you having me, Saul, and giving me a chance to introduce myself to your viewers here in Wyoming County. And if they have any other questions about me, you can go to my website, robortt.com, to try to get some more information about me.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Have a good rest of your night.